Hey guys, my name is Pavel Shmilov. I'm a commercial director at Oak Media House and I produce videos for brands and nonprofits. I just wanted to share a few tips that I've been able to pick up over the years as a Sony Alpha filmmaker so that way you can get the most out of your camera for your next shoot. I'll also include a link below that I have everything typed out for you to read along, as well as my personal settings for Cine4 picture profile. And if you prefer to follow along that way, just head to my website and you can check that out. All right, let's begin. So the first thing I want to check off is my bit depth. Bit depth is the amount of colors and information that your camera is picking up. The default setting is AVC HD on the Sonys, but the problem with that one, in my opinion, is it's got a capped bit depth. You can get a bit more color out of the XAVC S bit depth setting, and so those are the two options that Sony allows on their Alpha cameras. I tend to find that the XAVC S setting allows me to have greater information in the shadows, and I find that I have less color noise in my image, so that's the one I prefer to use. The only downside is that the file sizes are going to be larger to work with, but if you don't mind that, then I would go with that setting. Alright, so the next thing is color space. There's two options for you in that, and the one that I prefer to use is sRGB color space compared to the Adobe RGB, because it's the default color space for work on the online world. The Adobe RGB color space does allow you a little bit more flexibility because it captures more colors. However, whenever you're uploading it to the computer, you may see that your final grade doesn't really look the same online as it does on your computer. And so being the default color space, that's the one that I prefer to work with. The next thing is frame rate. Don't confuse frame rate with shutter speed, because frame rate is the amount of frames that are taken in a second versus shutter speed is how long the shutter is open for throughout the duration of that shot. So for frame rate, I go with 24p. That one is the default setting for any cinematic movie that you'll be seeing at a theater or online, and just looks the most normal whenever you see motion or people walking. I always use the 180-degree rule, and what that means is essentially it's double the shutter speed as your frame rate. So if you shoot at 24p, make sure to double that, and that would be 150. On Sony Alpha cameras, that's 145th, so that's as close as possible to that 180-degree rule. And if you're shooting in 60p, it would be 1/20th shutter speed, and 120p would be 240 shutter speed, or 1/240. I like to have my zebras on 100 plus, so that way it maximizes the highlight blown threshold and allows me to have as much of the highlights as possible before I see that it's being overexposed. When you have it to 100 and plus, its threshold is at about 109% versus 100%, and it allows you to capture more detail than the default setting of 70. If you keep it at 70, you'll see that some of your highlights are going to be overexposed with the zebras, but you can actually get a bit more out of them if you just have it at the 100 plus, so that way you're not just stopping it right there. You keep opening up your aperture and you're able to capture a bit more detail, and that way you're not capping yourself off on some details that could be in the image used later on. Monitoring exposure is incredibly important. On the Sony Alpha cameras, unfortunately, they don't have a waveform monitor and they don't have false color monitor, but what they do have is the zebras, as well as a histogram that you can pull up on your live view display. So having a histogram alongside zebras will allow you to make sure that you're in that range that gives you the best possible exposure for your images. General rule of thumb, you're keeping that blob about right in the middle, little left, little right, then you should be good with your image. But I don't really like to underexpose or overexpose. I prefer to use the spot meter. That way I can just point it right at the subject. I know where my exposure levels are at, and I can adjust my aperture accordingly to that. In short, the fastest way to check your exposure is using the histogram. That's going to give you the most accurate representation of the exposure that your camera is capturing at the time. Again, I'd use an external monitor and use false color alongside a waveform, but we're just talking about internal camera settings for this video. The Sony camera, in my opinion, that I've got isn't the fastest for autofocus, and I also use a little bit of an older Nikon lens with an adapter on my Sony camera, and so the autofocus doesn't even work with the older vintage lenses, but I do really like the look and the zoom capabilities of that lens, and I just use manual focus all the time anyway. I get in a habit of using manual focus, and a quick thing that you can do to check it is press the center button, and that will allow you to zoom in into the image, and you can see a magnified picture of what your camera is seeing, and that way you can just dial in your focus perfectly. So for white balance, I always make sure I use a manual white balance, and to do that you're gonna have to switch from your video mode to photo M mode on your dial at the top of the camera and capture your white balance with a white card. I always put the white card where the subject is going to be sitting. That way they're in the light that you're shooting for, and you're going to get the most accurate shot possible and the best colors when you're uploading it into your editing program. I would never use auto white balance because the camera is constantly going to be adjusting for it, and you're going to have a mix of colors on the subject, in the background, and you'll see different hues kind of bounce around as the camera is looking to adjust its white balance. For audio, I never input it into the camera itself because the 3.5mm jack just doesn't give you the quality that you need for professional grade footage. I only use the internal camera microphone as scratch audio, so that way I can sync it up in post with my external recorder. My preferred mic setup is a Rode NT-G2, and that shotgun mic is connected to a Zoom H4n. I find that audio is going to be much better, and make sure that you've got your audio recording as close as possible to the subject. You usually want to keep it at about a foot or so away, and turn the volume all the way up on your recorder so that way you hear as much audio as possible, and turn down the gain as low as possible. You want your audio levels to be jumping between a -12 and -6 decibels, and that way you're going to get the cleanest audio without it going over zero and clipping and being unrecoverable in post. The last thing to cover is going to be picture profile, and this is definitely a hot topic for Sony filmmakers. Many people like to shoot in S-Log2, also known as Picture Profile 7, because it allows them the most amount of flexibility in post and gives you the most neutral image to work with, allowing you to capture as much dynamic range as possible compared to the other picture profiles. However, after doing a lot of tests both indoor and outdoor, really putting the camera through its paces, I've landed on Cine 4 with a couple custom modifications that will also be in the link below, and you can copy those settings if you like and see for yourself. I did a lot of testing just to make sure that the shadows that I was getting and the highlights I was getting were up to the standard that I really needed to deliver to the clients, and keeping that goal in mind, the S-Log2 just really wasn't working for me. The native ISO that you have to shoot is the base ISO. So that's the lowest ISO, giving you the best image quality possible without having to introduce additional grain. With the PP7 or S-Log2, you have to start at a base ISO of 1600 compared to 400 ISO with Cine 4. So that right there automatically just puts the shadows in low lit situations at a point that I just couldn't work with. It was introducing a lot of color noise that I didn't like into the image and just really degrading the quality without being able to work with it in post. Now, what people say is you have to overexpose S-Log2 by 2 stops, if not 2.5 stops. And I'd bring down the shadows in post to the same levels as the Cine 4 had, and I would match those levels up using a waveform monitor. That way everything was the same comparing the two images. Even after overexposing by 2 stops and bringing the shadows down to the same levels as what I was getting with the 400 ISO in Cine 4, it still just had too much noise for me, and that is part of the reason why I continue to shoot with Cine 4. The other reason is Cine 4 really works with my workflow, and I really like the speed that I can achieve the colors that I need to in my color grading process. And so when I bring it into DaVinci Resolve, being able to color correct first the white balance as well as the highlights and the shadows, and achieving the skin tones that I need, and then putting a grade onto it, it was just a much quicker process, and I preferred the outcome of those images compared to S-Log2. I'll also work with other people, and it also speeds up the workflow when I'm delivering footage to them to edit and they bring it back to me. And so turnaround time is really important, and sacrificing just a bit of dynamic range for me, in my opinion, it was really worth it to go over to Cine 4. Plus, on top of that, I don't really shoot in high contrast situations very much. I try to avoid that. I think S-Log2 is great for people who have no control over the lighting environment, But if you're somebody like me who is able to control their lighting environment by either introducing new lights or shooting in a different scenario, or even taking lights away through negative fill, you can modify your lighting sources to the point where you don't necessarily need that wide dynamic range, and you'd much rather prefer getting truer colors as well as better low light performance. I'll have a link with the settings that I use for my Cine 4 that I tried out from Cody Blue, and they really work out for me, so give them a try and see what you guys think about that. Let me know if you have any more questions about your Sony camera for your next shoot. Definitely love to help you out, so feel free to leave a comment or share this video with someone that might find it useful. And if you need anything else, just head to my website, www.oakmediahouse.com, and you can also check out my productions on there. I'll have a written form of everything that I went over, as well as my specific settings listed below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.